Ms. Hughes, whenever you're ready.
I bet it took you just a few minutes to realize that this wasn't an accident. Amy's face down, on her hands and knees, rake in her back, 6 puncture wounds. For the defendant to continue to think that this is an accident is implausible. The reason he stuck with that story for 6 days was because this was his plan. Every little thing that he did points right to his guilt. The defense wants you to believe that Amy's a liar. You would think that Amy's on trial for her own murder. Amy's the liar, Amy's the bad person, Amy's the one that does Google searches. It's asinine. They want you to believe that Amy's friends are all lying, that she lied to them and they're coming in here and lying to you, that they're all making this up, that they just want the defendant to go down. Do you think they want the right person to be responsible for this murder? To accept responsibility? If all of these witnesses are lying, if this is this big conspiracy.
I think that is an incorrect statement of my argument. I didn't say those witnesses are lying.
Go ahead, counsel.
If this is some big conspiracy that the state has, that the police has against the defendant, wouldn't these witnesses have made it better? Wouldn't they have all came in here and said the exact same thing? No, because Amy was telling them different parts about what was going on with her life. That makes sense. She's telling her brother how she wants a divorce and how she's asking her brother to keep furniture for her. It makes sense she's not telling her brother about her affair. She's telling some of her friends about her affair, about what's going on in her relationship. She's talking about different things with different people, which we all do all the time. Amy wasn't lying. She wasn't making this up. Why would she make it up? There's no reason why she made it up, because she didn't want people to be mad she was having an affair. She was going around telling people she was having an affair. It's not like she needed to come up with some big excuse as to why. If the defendant really believed that this affair was over, then why did he text Terry Stainer, "Everyone is lying to me"? He wants you to believe that, just like he wanted John Turbett to believe it when he first didn't bring up Jerry Frazier at all. And the defense wants you to think that interview with John Turbett wasn't good. He didn't give him the opportunity to actually deny it. Again, what I say is not evidence. What this man says is not evidence. The only evidence in this case is what comes from this witness stand and these exhibits that you get to take back there with you. You are to determine what you believe from these witnesses and these evidence. Think when you look at that clip of the defendant. This is a man who for 6 days is grieving his wife. He's so upset. This horrible, tragic thing happened. He is told that somebody came onto his property and butchered his wife with this corn rake, and he doesn't react at all. You are allowed to consider his actions before and after this homicide. Who acts like that? It doesn't make sense. Let's talk about Tristan again. This poor kid who didn't want to be here, who didn't want to testify, whose mother was brutally attacked, who had to find her. And they're saying, well, just believe him, right? Believe him. There is one vital piece of information that keeps changing in Tristan's testimony, and it's the amount of time that he's away from Dad. that he's initially not away from him, then it's 1 minute and 40 seconds, and then it's I don't know. And why? That's vital because that information buries him. We have tons of other evidence, but that seals the deal. Tristan's story keeps changing because he's coming to terms with the truth. He's a 13-year-old kid that wants to go back to the way things were, but it's never going to be that way because his mother is dead. When you think about not only the Google searches, but when you think about the defendant's testimony, he admits what he can't deny and denies what he can't admit. There's certain things he has to admit, right? He thought this was an accident. He didn't remember about the cameras. There's lots of things, and I won't go over it because I know that you guys were paying attention, you remember the evidence. And everything he admits, he has an excuse for. Everything. Organs of the body, buoyancy, anything that's somewhat damning, he's going to admit. Then there's the ones that are really bad, he just has to deny. He has to deny killing unfaithful women. He has to deny the ones about infidelity. He can't admit that. And again, they want you to believe that Amy is conducting those searches. I implore you to look through those Google searches. And yes, from the beginning, the state has conceded that Amy has done some searches on them. Does that mean she did those ones? No. Look at those searches. Look at the ones that we told you were relevant. Look at before and after, surrounding those and the exact times, not days before or hours before. Look at the ones within minutes, and you will see that it's the defendant looking for combines and other things. Now let's talk about this 911 call. Again, the defense told you what they believe it says, and I told you what I believe it says. But that's not for you, or it is for you to determine, not just to listen to what we say. And again, I'm just going to ask you to please listen to it over and over. Listen to it as many times as you need. 6, 53, and 7. And determine for yourselves what it says. When you take that with all the other evidence, you know what the defendant's state of mind that was that day. And the defense wants you to think that because the 911 is recorded, that the defendant would never say anything like this. This is a man who's excited, right? And he is excited. He's excited because he has to pretend he's excited. He's also excited because he just carried out this murder. It doesn't matter whether he planned it or not. He's still under the excitement of what happened. He just took a corn rake and stabbed his wife with it. Now he's in part of the cover-up. If you listen to that 911 tape, you can determine for yourselves what he says at those periods, and you will see that it just is another piece of evidence. This is not a Hail Mary. We don't need that 911 call. We don't need it. We don't need any part of that 911 call. It's just another piece of evidence that adds to everything else. Now, the defendant wants you to think that this is a whodunit, right? They talked a little bit about DNA and CSI and all that stuff. And what Agent John Turbett told you, it wasn't what the defense summarized his statement. It was that they follow the evidence. The evidence from day one has pointed at the defendant. But they did a 3.5-month investigation, interviewing 50 people. 19 search warrants. This wasn't a hurry, let's hurry up and arrest him. They did a thorough investigation. And every piece of evidence, every one that kept coming in, pointed straight to the defendant, proving more and more what he did. And just ask yourselves, because as we've been talking about the common sense, right? Use your common sense. Did maybe the defendant not call 911 was because he wanted to get Amy in the car? He wanted a reason to touch this rake? As we talked about in jury selection, who is the one that determines the crime scene? Who determines the witnesses? Who determines what evidence to leave? The defendant does. He's the one that decides to commit that crime at that moment around the people that he does and leave what evidence he does. Think about that. This was a cold and calculated plan. It was planned for months and months. And even on that day, the defendant had a plan. It's not that this all just happened. The investigation never went off track. When you do listen to the 911 call and the defendant talks about Amy falling on the corn rake, that's another piece of evidence for you to consider when you look at everything. If as a person, if you find a loved one impaled with a corn rake, the fact that you're just going to jump to the conclusion that they fell on it, again, it just shows that he's telling this story from the beginning. The fingernail clippings, this suspect who's just out there roaming the streets. Oh my goodness, Delaware County must be such a horrible, it's in danger right now because there's somebody out there that committed this murder. No, John Turbot told you why there was no finger clippings. There was no analysis done on them. The defense can get up here all they want and try to tell you that there's injuries around her fingernails, but that's not what the evidence shows. John Turbot told you that her fingernails, according to the Emmy report, were short and intact. And look at those pictures of Amy's hands from both Dr. Thompson and Dr. Cruz. There is injuries on the top of her hands. There is none near her fingernails. There is no evidence that she scratched anybody or that happened. There's also no evidence that somebody attacked her from the front, like the defense said in their closing. There is evidence that she has injuries there. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened that day inside that shed. You know who knows? The defendant, because he was there that day in that shed with Amy, and he made sure the only other person that would be able to tell us isn't here. She's dead because of what he did. We do not need fingernail clippings to convict the defendant. Look through those jury instructions, every single page. Nowhere does it say we need DNA evidence. Nowhere does it say the state has to have fingernail clippings. We need to prove the elements that I went over with you in my opening closing, and that is what we have done here. The defense wants you to believe that this whole second affair thing is put to bed. It's over. That everything is going great. And I don't want to belabor this again because I know that you guys have gone over this. But Jerry Frazier tells you he's still communicating with Amy. He testified that up until when they started that Gmail account, until her death, the date of her death, they are communicating between 15 and 40 times a day. Jerry Frazier tells you himself, days before her procedure, they meet and she performs oral sex on him. This affair wasn't over, and the defendant wants you to believe it was because he was planning this. Because this all along was his plan. We know it was his plan from the Google searches. This is something he's been thinking about for a long time. And things aren't that, coupled with what's going on in September and October, the defendant is still trying to pretend like their marriage is perfect. It's great, nothing's going on. She's in Ankeny for half of the time, but he's such a loving husband, he doesn't mind. It's ridiculous for you to believe that. The defense argued that who would send their 13-year-old to go and find their mother? You know who would do that? Somebody who's been planning and plotting to kill their mother. Somebody that had decided to do this. Somebody who had been planning it looking it up on Google, somebody who had been looking at all the different ways to do this. That was the significance of the other Google searches, to show you he can have an excuse for it all he wants, but when you look at it in light of all the other evidence, you know he was trying to figure out, how am I going to do this? And he had to make it look like an accident, right? Let's be honest. He had to at first, hoping that it would work. He couldn't do something out of the ordinary. And what would be something that would maybe seem plausible, maybe if he carried it out the right way, didn't strike her twice, a farm accident. Now, the defense wants you, I don't remember, he wants you to, something about a used car analogy, something about we don't want you to take it for a test drive, and we just want you to buy the car. Absolutely not. Take this car for a drive. Take out pieces of evidence, put it back in. Look at it. Look at one piece, look at other pieces. Most of this evidence on its own convicts the defendant. And then when you look at it all together, every single sign, every piece of evidence points in only one direction, one place, directly towards the defendant. The defendant wants you to believe what? That all of these things that you heard about, all of these pieces of evidence are just happenstance. He wants you to believe that it just so happens that Amy is planning on leaving the defendant. And not only is she planning on leaving the defendant, it just so happens at the same time she's planning on leaving the defendant, she's storing furniture at her brother's. And just so happens at the time that she's planning on leaving the defendant, storing furniture at his house, that she's telling other people about her having an affair and how she's afraid of the defendant. And it just so happens that at the same time when she's having an affair, when she's planning on leaving the defendant, just so happens that the defendant is communicating with Eileen Fuller and saying things about Amy being gone and how he's angry and he's sick of this. And it just so happens, right around this same time, right before it, when all of this is happening, that the defendant finds out about the affair, that he confronts Jerry and Amy about the affair. And it just so happens, when all of these other things are happening, that Todd and Tristan have a conversation. And remember that? Remember Tristan told you that at one point he comes home from school and mom's crying and he goes outside and dad says something about mom talking to some guy? So it just so happens when all of these other things, when she's planning on leaving Todd, when she's telling her friends how afraid she is, when he's finding out about the affair, he's telling Tristan, it just so happens when all of that is happening that Amy has a procedure. And it just so happens that days before her procedure, it just so happens that they look up, the defendant with Taylor looks up organs of the body and looks at this map, specifically of organs. Just so happens. And it just so happens that 4 days later, no one else is around. It's just them on the farm. It just so happens that it's Tristan, Todd, and Amy out in the barn. And it just so happens when all these other things are going on that Amy gets dizzy, really dizzy from this procedure 4 days ago. And it just so happens not once, but twice she gets dizzy, twice. And it just so happens at that point, not the defendant, because he doesn't want you to believe it was him now, it was Tristan. Tristan said, hey, maybe mom should go get that pet carrier. Just so happens when all these other things are going on, at that moment, they decide the thing that would be helpful for us, even though you're so dizzy, is go get this pet carrier for us in this narrow way, because you'll be fine. You're too dizzy to stay out here with us and to help us clean a light fixture, but you're not too dizzy to go get a pet carrier that's 15 pounds. And it just so happens, you would have to believe that it just so happens, when all these other things are going on, there is some mystery attacker out waiting on the Mullis farm. Just happens to be there at the exact moment that Amy Mullis just so happens to go to a red shed. It just so happens that the mystery attacker sees a corn rake to use as a murder weapon. It just so happens when all these things are going on, and that nobody else is on the farm, even for that mystery attacker, because then nobody else can see him. And it just so happens that no one hears a thing, not one word, Nothing. Sees anything, hears anything. So this mystery person, who clearly didn't even did they have a plan to go there and murder Amy without a weapon? Just so happens to be such a good murderer that nobody hears them and they leave absolutely no evidence. And it just so happens when all of this is going on, Todd and Tristan have a conversation about that pet carrier. And it just so happens that Todd sends Tristan to go look for it. Not back in the house to look for Amy. It just so happens. Not that he decides to go look for her. Not that he tells Tristan to go in the house and make sure Mom's okay. It just so happens when all of this is going on that he sends his 13-year-old son to go look for Amy, or that pet carrier. And it just so happens when all of this is going on, the defendant runs to that shed and he doesn't call 911. And it just so happens that when all of this is going on, he chooses to just pick up Amy and pull that rake out. And it just so happens that he makes that 911 call. It just so happens with all of these other things that he says she fell on a corn rake. And it just so happens that he goes to the police station that day and he maintains that she fell on a corn rake and that he doesn't tell anybody about the cameras. It just so happens, according to his testimony, that he didn't even remember about the cameras. It just so happens. The next day is the first time he thinks about it, but he doesn't tell anybody about it. And it just so happens that those cameras weren't working because he thinks some cats got them. And it just so happens that the next day, the cameras come back up. And it just so happens, the Google searches, they just happen to be there when all this other stuff is going on. All of this other stuff that points right at him. It just so happens that somebody is using his Google account to search for infidelity and killing your cheating wife and all of those things. It just so happens. It just so happens that when he is told that this is an accident, that he has no response because he's so taken aback. It just so happens. You would have to believe that he is the most unluckiest man in the world. No, because that's not the truth. Because every single one of these things shows that he did this. Now, the defense told you in my opening, in his closing, that I'm gonna say that I proved to you that he did it. And I am here to prove that to you, and I have proved that to you. I have proved it by the witnesses, we've proved it by the testimony, we've proved it by everything you've heard in court. And absolutely, I told you in jury selection that we have the burden of proof. And it is a good and decent burden, and it is a burden that we embrace. It is a burden that is met every day in criminal courtrooms. It is beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not beyond all doubt. It is not beyond a shadow of a doubt. It is not beyond a scintilla of a doubt. It is beyond a reasonable doubt. And clearly, we have proven the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm not asking you to find the defendant guilty just because I want you to. It's because the law dictates it. All of the evidence supports it, and justice demands it. Find the defendant guilty.